take roll?
Yes. Dr. Beardsley?
Here.
Member Bachna?
Here.
Member Hovanec?
Here.
Member Jordan?
Here.
Dr. Haladina?
Here.
Member Smith?
Here.
Dr. Schlesman?
Here.
Member Geyer?
Here.
Representative?
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. So item number 1 on the agenda is the call to the public. Director Williams, have there been any forms submitted?
Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, we do have one call to the public request to speak form from Mark Jordanstad.
Good afternoon, Chair Geyer, members of the committee. My name is Mark Jornstead, Executive Director of the Arizona School Administrators. And for the past, almost 2 years now, I've been following the A through F school accountability evolving process very closely. I want to just take a moment today. I've been reading with great interest the various reports that committee members have compiled. Mr. Jordan, Mr. Geyer, Ms. Bachma, and others who, some of you who are on the line. I'm really impressed by the careful, close attention you're paying and the hard work in those reports you're preparing. I know it reflects hours of work. I know many of those hours are spent outside of your regular occupations. They're spent on Christmas holidays, on weekends, and this is one of the most important tasks the state board and you as a subcommittee of the board do, and I really want to, on behalf of the Arizona School Administrators, thank you for the really good work that you're doing, and I'm really encouraged by your deliberative process. So again, just thank you for what you're doing and keep it up.
Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, there are no more call to the publics.
Okay, thank you, Director Williams. Item number 2 on the agenda are the committee member reports on each of the technical committee assignments. So we will then have each of the individual committee members report on their findings and then discuss their findings. And then we'll try to get a recommendation for the board in regard to the items that are being discussed. Are there any concerns with that process as laid out today? So we'll review the findings, discuss the findings, and then have a potential recommendation to the board. So, Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, I do believe the first item number is 2A, which is the ceiling effect on student growth to target the side of the growth measure in regard to rewarding students as excelling the target. So I believe that was Member Bachna and Dr. Smith with some help from Dr. Beardsley as well. The presentation is on the screens as well as in your documents that you have in front of you.
Thank you. Dr. Smith and myself were tasked with looking at the ceiling effect associated with the relationship between SGT and SGP, and specifically looking at when a student has an SGT, a student growth to target number of 89 or higher, and an SGP of 89 or higher, they are not classified as exceeding the target because they can never get to that point of earning more than 10 percentile points above their target number. So any student that falls into that category of having an 89 SGT and end up having earned an 89 or higher SGP, the potential for them to go to the exceeds target as defined in the categories is not possible. So in looking at this information and looking at this effect, in analyzing the static file for the state, if you look under table 1, you can see a summary of the potential effects, if you scroll down a little bit on the screen there. So in looking at the state data file, the student level data file, for subject area 675, which is ELA, the total number of test records in the state that were in this ceiling effect potential is 10,695. These records are spread over 1,000 schools. And then the final column shows you the number of schools where 20 or more test records were impacted. So for many of these schools, it was 1 or 2 students. It wasn't, but looking at the final column, the numbers presented there, what that final 143 means is there were 143 schools with 20 or more test records in ELA that were impacted by this ceiling effect. When you look at the math, a few less records were impacted, 8,500 approximately. More schools were affected, but less had 20 or more records impacted by this ceiling effect. And generally, the schools with the 20 or more test records are schools with a lot more students and tended to be bigger high schools. If you scroll down in the document, I have a screenshot of the current year student growth target, the way that this is laid out. This is directly from the business rules. What happens when these students are classified as at or near target, they're never going to get the full points that they would earn if they were classified as exceeding target, exceed the target, because there is a cap on how many points you can earn at 99. So these students, even though they had a very high SGT and made that SGT as shown by their SGPs, they are only classified as being at or near the target. They're never classified as exceeding the target. When you scroll down and look at Table 2, what you see here is a portrayal of where those students are based on their prior year performance level. The first area is 675 for ELA. The number 1 is your minimally proficient students, number 2 is your partially proficient, and number 3 is your proficient students. The majority of these students are students that were minimally proficient the previous school year, had a very high SGT for the next school year for AZ Merit, and made that SGT. So they did very well on the test. In both ELA and in math, the majority of the students were falling into the minimally proficient category. You can see 92% of these students were in minimally proficient the previous school year for ELA, and for math, it was 91%. So again, if those students in those categories, the minimally proficient especially, were to be categorized as exceeding the target as opposed to being at or near target, they would earn 2 points of weight in this model. Finally, the last table presented here is just looking at the percentage by school of overall test records within the school that were impacted by this ceiling effect. So this analysis was done just looking at the schools with records within the ceiling effect and what percentage of their overall test records with SGPs and SGTs fell into this area. And at the range of percentages is presented up there. Some schools had 0.1 of their test records, so very, very few. Up to 20% of their test records for ELA were impacted by the ceiling effect. For math, it was 0.1 to 22.2%. Now, when you see those higher percentages, there's not that many schools falling into that, and most of those higher percentages are where the schools are smaller ends. So it becomes a bigger deal when the smaller end at the school. The median for all the schools was at about 1.3 for ELA and 1.1 for math, and then you can also see the mean of 2.1 for ELA and 1.9 for math. Dr. Smith, do you want to add anything to this?
No. Just as part of the discussion, just and some of the things that as we looked at the data, we only had the static file. So really, the task of what they asked us to do, we could only use the information we had set forth in front of us. So. Based on the file that we had, we really could only give information to the board as far as the impact.
So I guess I would just summarize in saying that if this ceiling effect is changed, if we as a committee feel that this should be something that should be looked at and the rule changed, then it would have the impact of improving, potentially improving letter grades and also improving the amount of points that those schools earned for those areas.
And I just wanted to add, thank you, Member Bachna and Director Williams. Just want to note here, it looks like a large majority of the students that are affected by the ceiling effect are in the minimally proficient category, which is likely going to be our schools that are at the sort of higher poverty levels just based on those correlations. So I definitely think that giving those students more points helps in a number of different fronts, both in terms of fairness and the correlations that we were looking at. Thank you.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, did any other committee members have any questions or concerns or discussion points they wish to bring up with Member Bachna or Dr. Smith in their work on this?
I would only reiterate, this is Christy Hervanitz, would only reiterate the point that we do have the exact opposite phenomenon with a floor effect, that there are possibly students that can't not meet the at or near target with the SGTs, and so I don't know if we should be adjusting for the ceiling effect without considering taking a look and adjusting for the floor effect as well.
Thank you, Member Hovanich. Just so the committee members know, like Vice Chair Guyer stated, in each of these agenda items, each member will present their findings. There'll be a discussion within the committee members, and then a motion and a roll call vote for the recommendation that goes to the State Board of Education. It is very important that if a member of the committee votes no with the recommendation or chooses to abstain, that the no vote or the abstention is verbalized for myself and for the record so that the State Board of Education members know why the person voted no or chose to abstain from the vote.
Yeah, thank you, Director Williams. So was there any, Director Williams, was there any further questions, comments regarding the 2A on the agenda, the ceiling effect? I'm not hearing any. I guess the next item then would be to have a roll call vote. And Director Williams?
Vice Chair Guyer, there needs to be a motion prior to the roll call vote. So if Member Bachna has... Dr. Schlesman, go ahead and sit down.
Oh, I can't see
where if Member Bachna has a recommendation that she believes is a good recommendation that she would like the Technical Advisory Committee to vote on, then Ms. Bachna can state that motion. I will record that motion. I may ask you to repeat it, and I will most likely repeat what you told me to the committee so that you know exactly what you were voting on. And then we'll do a roll call vote once that motion is seconded.
Okay, so I motion to change the business rule to account for the ceiling effect to correct this situation.
Yeah, Director Williams. So then...
She needs a second.
Okay, sorry.
I'll second.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion from committee members? And the motion I have is to change the business rules to account for the ceiling effect in the growth measure.
I'll just make the point, or I could explain my vote, but thank you,
members Bachna, Amran Beardsley, and Smith for your work on this.
If there's no discussion, then Vice Chair Guyer, I can do a roll call vote.
Yes, thank you, Director Williams.
Dr. Beardsley?
Yes.
Member Bachna?
Yes.
Member Hovanich?
No.
Member Hovanich, would you like to explain your no vote, or would you like your previous comments to be recorded for the State Board's record?
Previous comments to be recorded for the State Board record, please.
Thank you. Member Jordan?
Yes.
Dr. Haladina?
Yes.
Member Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Fleshman?
Aye.
And Vice Chair Guyer?
Yes.
With your vote of 7-1, the motion of change business rule to account for the ceiling effect and the growth measure will be your recommendation that will go to the State Board of Education at the January 29, 2018 State Board meeting. Member Guyer, with that vote, I would recommend moving on to item 2B, changing the denominator of the K-8 acceleration measure to points eligible.
Yes, moving on to agenda 2B, which is Member Jordan's discussion of the change of the denominator for the K-8 acceleration readiness measure, 2 points eligible. So with that, we'll leave it to Member Jordan.
Okay, thank you, Acting Chairman, Mr. Guyer, and members of the board. The last time we met, I presented this particular document. Well, not this one, but this is a much cleaner version of what I presented a couple weeks ago. But it explains the accelerated readiness and reviewed on how it's currently calculated and how the total possible points for accelerated readiness is capped at 10. And with within a subset of that, you have the subgroup points that could be earned, where that's capped at 6, when within the subgroups there could be a maximum of 20. And then overall, a maximum of 40 points within the subgroups. Within the entire accelerated readiness, it's a maximum of 20, but they're capped. So with the capping on this, one of the things that I made, one of the observations that I made when I went to using the denominator, no matter what option I came up with for using the denominator, it wasn't going to benefit that many schools. It was only going to decrease the available points, or not necessarily the available points, but even the actual earned points for schools with their letter grades. So one of the things that I did was after I presented this a couple weeks ago for discussion, went on ahead and came to the conclusion that, with a recommendation that we look for additional ways of schools to earn accelerated readiness points, so that the 9 schools, as I pointed out here, that have a maximum of 9 points might be able to get an additional 2 or 3 or 4 points available to them, or that they could potentially earn, so that they could get the maximum amount of 10 points. Of all the schools that are receiving letter grades or have received letter grades to the current model, it was only 9 that came up with, that couldn't reach quite the maximum available of 10. But they got 9, and applying a denominator would only give them a fraction of a point and won't really get them anywhere closer to the full points that they would need, no matter what kind of proration that we would do or using a denominator. So therefore, my recommendation is to look for other data points, or that the State Board of Education takes into consideration other possible data points that could be included within the accelerated readiness that preferably all schools could potentially attain. That way, these 9 schools could potentially be eligible for maybe up to about 15 to 20 points, as opposed to limited to just 9. And the other observation that I made is that a lot of the schools with less than 30 students tested, they were so small they weren't ready. They weren't getting a rating anyway with letter grade. So it's just simply because of their size. Even the accelerated readiness model was not going to address their needs very well.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, if I may ask Member Jordan a question in regards to his recommendation.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Member Jordan, with your recommendation of looking at other data points that all schools would be able to receive, and we have 9 schools that have 9 points currently, would your recommendation be more accurate to include the term for future iterations of the A through F system? And the reason I bring that up is the timeline to finalize these letter grades is coming to a close, and I'm not sure how much time is available to look into other data sets. In addition, with the 17-18 letter grades, the federal government is requiring Arizona to take out the science from the proficiency indicator, and potentially the state board could move the science proficiency score to the acceleration measure.
Well, definitely for the business rules for 2018, consider adding more. That's for 2017. I don't necessarily want to make a recommendation in a vacuum by myself, and saying that these are the recommendations. I prefer to have other people involved in generating ideas for the there might be additional data points if we could pull that off. Now, looking ahead for 2018, knowing that the science is going to be pulled off, not included for the proficiency, it might make sense to begin to include that in the accelerated readiness. So that's one option there. Might there be others available or that we could possibly consider and possibly use in accelerated readiness? Probably. I just don't know of any off the top of my head. I really haven't had time to really give a whole lot of thought to that, just simply because of my other responsibilities. And once again, it's not something that I want to recommend by myself. I'd rather have a discussion among other people to generate potential data points that we could include within the accelerated readiness, so that that particular metric could be somewhat comparable to the high school model, where we have what schools can show or present numbers of students in different avenues heading off to college. I'm trying to remember all the options that they have of providing indicators as kids being college and career ready or being on a path going straight on into college or a career path.
Okay, Director Williams, do you have any more comments, Member Jordan? If not, then we could invite comments or questions from the other committee members regarding that.
I don't know how comfortable people are just leaving it as it is. So for the 9 schools, all they're eligible is just 9 points. If we could find a way to where we found another data point that they were eligible for, and great, and meet our timeline for the 2017 final letter grades.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I think the committee needs to look at, do you potentially hold up to attempt to find another data point for those 9 schools, the other schools in Arizona? I mean, I think that right now is what you're trying to weigh. So if the K-8 acceleration measure, changing the denominator to points eligible, only affects 9 schools, I think the work that Member Jordan has done to show that looking forward, the state board needs to find another data point to get those 9 schools eligible for those 10 points, I think is a very valid argument. But the committee needs to decide whether the recommendation to the state board would be to do nothing for the 16-17 school year, but then recommend they look at another data point for the 17-18 for those 9 schools. But again, that is the committee's decision. I do know that the last meeting, the committee members did talk at length in regard to how the K-8 acceleration points eligible only affected the 9 schools, and that maybe it wasn't something that needed to be changed within the 16-17 letter grades in order to finalize them.
So, Acting Chair Guyer, I agree that this needs to move forward. It's already late in, well, the date today is January 19th, and schools want action on their letter grades for FY17. So if there is no further discussion, I'll make a motion, but I don't want to make the motion before everyone has had a chance to speak.
Yeah, I have no further questions. Anyone else?
So,
I do have a question. Are there consequences, monetary consequences, that are going to be attached to these forthcoming? Or you might know.
Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, the governor has released his education budget, I believe it was last week, and originally for fiscal year 19, the A through F letter grade system was to be used for results-based funding. However, he came out through his education budget and stated that for fiscal year 19, they would revert back to fiscal year 18 formula, which is based upon the Easy Merit results. So, no.
Okay.
Currently.
Thank you.
So, Acting Chair Geyer, I move to include in our recommendation to the board, the State Board of Education, that they not change anything with the acceleration readiness measure for FY17 grades and consider additional measurements within acceleration readiness K-8 for the future.
Oh, I'll second that.
Vice Chair Geyer, is there any discussion prior to a roll call vote of the motion that Dr. Schlesman motioned and to recommend to the State Board of Education not to change the acceleration readiness measure for fiscal year or for 16-17 letter grades, but recommend additional measurements for future. Now, Dr. Schlesman, you ended at future, but if we add future iterations so that it's clear to the public what you mean by future?
That's a friendly amendment. I'll accept it.
You have to.
Someone on the committee has to make that amendment, or
Chair Geyer, Dr. Schlesman, if you want to add iterations to the end, you have to ask your second if that's okay with him.
So, Acting Chair Geyer, Member Jordan, are you okay with that amendment?
Repeat it for me one more.
To make it iterations for future iterations.
Yes, I'm comfortable with that. Yes, okay. I'm in agreement.
Okay. The Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, was there any committee discussion on the motion?
Chairman Geyer, members of the board, what I want to do is reiterate, of the 9 schools that were limited to the 9 points, all of them got letter grades, and I think all of them got at least a C or higher. I think a couple of them were A schools. So I just want to present that out in the discussion also.
Thank you. Any further comments or discussion before the roll call vote? I'm not hearing any.
Dr. Beardsley?
Yes.
Member Bachna?
Yes.
Member Hovanich?
Yes.
Member Jordan?
Yes.
Dr. Haladina?
Yes.
Member Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Schlesman?
Aye.
And Member Geyer?
Yes.
With your vote of 8-0, the recommendation of this to recommend that the State Board of Education not change acceleration readiness measures for the 16-17 letter grades, but recommend to include additional measures for future iterations will be presented to the State Board of Education at the January 29, 2018 State Board meeting. With that, Vice Chair Geyer, I would recommend moving on to 2C, lowering the uncounted English language learner measure.
Yes, thank you, Director Williams. So we will now move on to agenda item 2C, which is the lowering of the end count of the English language learner measure, presented by Chair Dr. Schlesman.
Thank you, Acting Chair Geyer. So what you see before you is an update to a report that I supplied 2 weeks ago. But I did stay with version 3.1 of the data that was sent, so it was the same data set that I had used for the previous calculations. I talked about Table 1 last time, so I don't think it's necessary. If anyone needs to review that, there's audio recording available, or actually video, for you to watch. Executive Director Williams asked what the preliminary letter grades of the schools that were shown in Table 1 are. So I presented that in Table 2. Table 2 is the K-8 schools, and Table 3 is the 9-12 schools. And then in Table 4, rather than modeling something, which you'll see my discussion later of why I did not think it was meaningful to model the entire data set, was I provided some illustrative cases of what would happen if the end count were lowered. The cases that I showed, even though Tables 2 and 3 show 19 through 11, I limited this to 15 because I would be extremely uncomfortable as a researcher if the end count were lowered below 15. And as you see, the table shows the current points eligible, current points earned. I did round up the current points earned because they were presented with 2 decimal points. And those of you that know how to mine data would be able to identify those schools on another public file. So I rounded up to make that less obvious. And then the other columns, starting with points eligible if ELL were greater than or equal to 15, is presented. The actual points that the school would earn. And I put a question mark in front of the impact on the letter grade, because I will discuss that in just a minute. And you see the asterisk point. There are too many outstanding questions to meaningfully make a prediction on a school's revised letter grade. So the pieces that were added to the discussion is I included the concerns we have as the Technical Advisor Committee about lowering end count below 20. I referred back to a report that was given on 11/28 of last year that talked about the technical concerns, and I referred to the pages in the report that we supplied to the State Board of Ed about lowering end count. And for those, as I said, aforementioned reasons, I, in this report, recommend not changing the that the reasons for not lowering the end count don't change because it's ELLs, even though that is permissible. And then I have the bullet points about the things that are still in progress, although we just made a decision about the bullet point number 3, the ceiling effect. That has been corrected. And in fact, ADE did send a corrected data file. Thank you very much again, ADE, with the student growth to target data being corrected. And so also my understanding from Dr. Fletcher's presentation at the December board meeting is that ADE is recalculating cut scores before the bonus points were added. So that is one of the reasons that the impact on the letter grades was not modeled, in quotes. Member Geyer is doing work on a hybrid model for the non-typical grade configurations that will also affect letter grades. And, we just had the discussion, but we decided not to endorse that, changing the denominator. But for all of those reasons, I didn't think it prudent to invest the time to model lowering the N count for ELL with all of the other considerations that are currently happening.
Thank you, Dr. Schlesman. And Director Williams, are there any questions, comments from the other committee members regarding the presentation by Dr. Schlesman? Not hearing any to this point.
So Acting Chair Guyer, Director Williams, do we need a motion to this effect about recommending not to lower, or is this just informational?
Vice Chair Guyer, Dr. Schlesman, members of the committee, a recommendation needs to come forth in regard to lowering the N count. So if committee members have any questions in regard to the work that you did on page 13 of the packet, which is table 2 and table 3, you can see that in table 1 of Dr. Schlesman's work is that there are numerous schools that fall under a lower N count within the ELL indicator. The school could potentially earn more points. And as we see on table 4 in Dr. Schlesman's work, it could impact in the positive, right? Have their points go up as we see in that K8X, where it goes up from 83 to 93 because they're based out of 100 points as compared to the 90, right? But the letter grade stays the same as an A. And then you have that 912 double X, which they are out of 70 originally. With the lowering of the N count, they're out of 80. And that could potentially increase their letter grade to a D. I think the committee just needs to consider whether or not lowering the N count is something that they would like to entertain. I do know that the committee feels very strongly in regard to N count numbers and what that does to the system as a whole or to each individual indicator, but that is a discussion that the committee needs to have at this point, looking at the work that Dr. Schlesman did and then coming to consensus on a recommendation to the state board.
So Acting Chair Guyer, as further clarification to some of the points that Director Williams brought up, as you see with the illustrative cases, let's take a step back. So when you look at tables 2 and tables 3, you'll see that most of the schools that would be affected if the N count for ELL were reduced are K-8 schools. And you can see in the rows, like an example would be 19. The schools tend to have higher grades, and the illustrative cases that I presented, you see they were all already earning 90 points. By changing it to 100 points that they were eligible to earn, it still didn't make a difference with all of the speculation about what is going to happen with letter grades once these other changes get made. But you see that using the current business rule percentages, and that's why keep your tongue in your cheek about all this, and I have the question mark in front of it. An A school would still be an A, K-8. A B school would still be a B. And the F school would still be an F. Then, as you also look at table 3, the numbers for 912 schools drastically reduce if you lower the N count. So that it's really like if it's lowered to 19 students, that's only 4 schools. And of course, this is cumulative. So if you lowered to 18, it would be 2 plus 4, that's 6 schools. And again, now if you look at the illustrative cases, and I will, that school that was the 912XX that went from 70 points eligible to 80 would be much more satisfied with a D letter grade than an F. But again, we have other contingencies still out there, so we're not absolutely sure if that impact is correct. I will also say that these illustrative cases were randomly selected from the small group of schools that would have been impacted, and I almost did not follow the random selection for one of the K-8s because the title of the school was something secondary. And I was like, but you heard Dr. Fletcher make her presentation in December, and she said that data that ADE can present is only good as the data that they are provided. So if for some reason the school that had secondary in its name was in the K-8 file, that's what was provided to the Arizona Department of Ed. So it's it is what it is. And actually, I talked to the school leader of the school that had 0 for the current points eligible. It happens to be that I had that conversation. And he said that rating has been appealed. And I think successfully, because it wasn't, because as I looked at the data file, it said 0 points eligible, so that's what I wrote down in the table. But there were actually points that were earned for proficiency and points that were earned for other elements.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the TAC Committee. If I remember right, I think what the SBE was looking for, because we have a number of schools that may not have enough ELL in order to be eligible for 10 points for ELL. So now their maximum points eligible is 90 instead of 100, but it's prorated as they get their letter grade. So by lowering the N count to 15, obviously we're going to capture more. Your observation of schools with a smaller ELL count tested, or even count, they're going to be probably higher performing schools, and it's based on some observations that I get to see locally on a regular basis. So I guess the discussion is with lowering the N count so that other schools could have a maximum of 100 points as opposed to 20 points. Is that a way to go, or to keep it as it is, to where schools who do not meet that in count, they're going to be capped at 90 points anyway? So do we really need to make that change or an adjustment? I guess that's the biggest question. I don't know necessarily. I guess the only other place where lowering the in count might benefit schools would be fairly small schools that have a high percentage of ELL students. That's where it's going to benefit them, because now that gets them another data point. So I guess that's an area where I would want to begin to look. Will it impact extremely small schools with a high ELL population, a high percentage? So that's as I'm looking over what you presented, Dr. Schlesman, that's my question, and obviously it's going to be a subset of 217 schools. It's going to be a smaller number than that. And I'm in agreement with you. As we lower the number, we're going to see a greater fluctuation from year to year in possibly the point total. So I wanted to share those thoughts, and based on observations of ELL data that I do quite frequently in my own district. We do have some of those phenomena.
So Acting Chair Guyer, Member Jordan, and And in reference to the extremely small, there will be a model for extremely small schools, and the Attorney General has okayed that it be waived for the 16-17 school year, but that will be on the State Board of Ed's plate for future development.
Thank you, Dr. Schlesman. Following up on Member Jordan, your comments there, one thing that would make me feel more comfortable about including the ELL data for schools with 15 or more students between 15 and 19 would be seeing some kind of like impact average, like what is the average number of those ELL points that such schools were receiving, because I'm a little hesitant to want to go with something that could potentially adversely affect the schools across the state compared to the schools with the larger N. That's just my first concern. Again, just seeing sort of an impact. Like what is the average for those schools who have 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 students in the ELL measure? What are their average points earned, and how does that compare to their overall? Just to make sure that we're not, by adding this N count exception, we're not doing harm to potential grades.
Vice Chairman Guyer, members of the board, the kind of schools or the size that I'm talking about are those that have about 50 students tested or less on the AZ merit. That's going to be a fairly small school, and then say of that group, they have about they have a fairly small percent. They may have only 15 students who are ELL, but that's going to be a substantial percentage of their student population. So those are the ones, and they will get a letter grade. Those are the schools that I'm concerned about, and I just don't know how many of those there are. I have to go back and look at the data. I left my computer behind, so I can't look at it immediately.
Yeah, thank you, Member Jordan. Yeah, that raises another point that kind of fits in with my, not really concern, but more of just like a kind of like more information to help better make sure that the decision or conclusion is the correct and best one based on the data and the evidence we have, to make sure that, so for those smaller schools, are we possibly giving them more points, because if they have a small number of N, like say 50, they may not earn as many of their acceleration readiness points in the K-8 model. So, any other questions or comments regarding that?
This is Christy Hovanitz. I am supportive of lower N sizes, N size of 10 or 15, because it's the universe and represents the universe of students that are in these schools. I don't know, though, why we would be talking about it only with respect to ELs and not with respect to the other indicators and the components with those indicators. We've seen a lot of situations where there are small school examples and students with disability subgroups, and also the demographic acceleration values we were talking about earlier. So I don't necessarily think it's the right thing to do to change just the EL N size to make it smaller, but I would be supportive of smaller N sizes across the board.
I just want to add that I continue to be concerned about lowering the N count below 20 for all the measures, but also I think in terms of explaining this to our schools, keeping it consistent where the N is 20 is easier to explain than why certain areas have a lower N and some than others.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, concerns regarding lowering the N count for the ELL measure?
Well, this is Tom, and I've said this before, and I'll just say it again briefly. For psychometric reasons, lowering the N count is not a good strategy for the reasons given already, but also in terms of adding what we call construct relevant variance or bias, and also it's less reliable. We don't know about the composition of the sample as it changes, because we know because students come and go in these cohorts, it's hard to really manage the differences in means as they change when people come and go. So I think we have a psychometric support for keeping the N count the way it is.
Thank you, Dr. Haladina. Any other comments?
This is Member Beardsley. I'll add to that as well. In terms of the states that I've studied that are using systems like this, there's no state of which I'm aware that has an N count lower than 20. And there's been a lot of debate about that too, and they've stuck with 20 or higher.
There are a substantial number of states that have an N count less than 20.
Acting Chair Guyer, when everyone has had a chance to speak, I'll make a motion.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Schlesman. Is there any other comments, questions regarding the lowering of the N count? Hearing none.
So, Acting Chair Guyer, I move that the recommendation of the TAC to the State Board of Education be not to lower the N count for English language learner measure below the 20 that currently exists, and to keep it consistent for all measures.
I second the motion.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, Dr. Schlesman made the motion to recommend to the State Board of Education to not lower the N count for the English language learner measure of the A through F accountability system below 20, and to keep the N count, I changed it to N count, consistent for all measures. That was seconded by Member Bachna. This would be the appropriate time to have a discussion within committee members.
Thank you, Director Williams. Are there any further comments regarding the motion by Dr. Schlesman? Hearing none to this point.
Roll call vote. Dr. Beardsley?
Aye.
Member Bachna?
Yes.
Member Hovanich?
No, and it's because the way the amendment is stated, I would support it being lower than 20 and would like to reflect that 22 states across the country use an N size lower than 20.
Thank you for your comment. It will be recorded for the State Board of Education. Member Jordan?
Yes.
Dr. Haladina?
Can I answer yes and explain that just because other states do it doesn't make it right?
Dr. Haladina, your comment will be recorded for the State Board of Education. Member Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Schlesman?
Aye.
Member Guyer?
Yes.
By your vote of 7-1, the recommendation to the State Board of Education to not lower the N count for the ELL measure of the A through F letter grade system to below 20 and to keep the N count consistent for all measures will go to the State Board of Education at the January 29, 2018 State Board of Education meeting. Member Guyer would recommend moving on to the next agenda item, which is 2D, utilizing the hybrid model for non-typical grade configurations and determining how to prorate schools with a score of not rated.
Okay, thank you, Director Williams. Just moving on to agenda item 2D, which is utilizing the hybrid model, which is actually for my discussion with you all today. So during the last technical committee meeting, I actually went through the sort of the highlights of the hybrid model in terms of the Model A, Model B, and Model C provided there in the handout, and went through the sort of the mechanics of it, sort of give some explanation of modeling steps that were being used for these different calculations. And what's new with this approach and what was added to it was the C1 method to try and account for schools that had received one letter grade and an NR that were what I would call like complete schools, that is K-8 and 9-12 schools combined or combined schools, to use one grade and the NR to adopt a model based on the hybrid approach to merge into the grade that was available based on the data for the configuration that was graded. That's just listed there as C1. I'll get into more details of that as we go through the information. So again, just to recap and review, Model A is known as the merge to K-8 approach, where schools did not have currently a grade 12 in their configuration. Likely these, as indicated by the board during the last board meeting, these were likely schools that were growing into being a full high school. So these schools without a grade 12 would adopt the K-8 model, that is merging all of the information into the K-8 model as available. And that's Model A. Model B would be for schools that included grade 12 but began with the 5th grade or higher, adopt the 9-12 model. That is the merge to 9-12 approach. And the intent behind the Model B is if you have a 5th, 6th to 12th grade model or school framework, your majority of school students are actually going to be in the high school configuration. I reviewed data on that very topic during the one of the prior TAC meetings to show that, in fact, schools under Model B generally were majority high school students. A Model C is the pro-rate approach, where you have grades K1, 2, 3, 4 to 12 using both K-8 and 9-12 models, wherein we prorate the K-8 grades with the 9-12 grades using the full annual year enrollment. So the new approach under C, the C.1, which is just for lack of better labeling, I just made it C.1. If a combined school is only rated on one of the two, take all of the available information we can get, merge it together with the model that was adopted and graded to calculate the best estimate for that model. So this grade would use any merged proficiency, growth, and ELL measures available. I did just want to point out, and I believe this is in a footnote, no ELL mergers were attempted. The ELL measure is actually graded based on all of the available students in the sample, and then scores are assigned to it. So it isn't actually a percentage, it's an amount of awarded points. So I didn't feel it was appropriate to try and merge that together due to the simple fact that if a school earned all of the points on one side and only 2 on the other, you don't want to average the 10 with the 2 because likely they would still earn a 10 on the one side. So that merger was not done, largely due to the fact that there simply were not enough students available in the ELL measure for these non-typical configurations. And just also, I feel that would be more in the veins of the department to do when they actually adopt an approach to do that modeling with a full set of data for the K-8 and 9-12 together to do a single unified ELL calculation there.
Vice Chair Guy, or members of the committee, if I may ask you a question. Do you have any business rules that go along with Model C.1? I was just thinking ahead if the board adopts the tax recommendation from today and then directs the modeling to be done at the department in order to set cut scores at the February meeting, then the department would need business rules.
Okay, so the business rules for C.1 will either be the business rules for Model A or Model B as appropriate based on the grade configuration, which configuration was given a grade and which configuration was not. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Director Williams. Okay, just an update on the data results here. Thank you to the Department of Education. I actually received an updated SGP and SGT cell value data file. This was discussed during the last December 4th board meeting, and I went and dug right in and got the page numbers of those points right off the PowerPoint and the handout deck from that board meeting. So you can all look that up if you're interested. The SGT calculation was adjusted, as well as there was some missing data in the files provided by the department that were filled in. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on the steps that were taken to get the SGP and SGT values. Basically, business rules were applied to recalculate those because the department provided the cell values. So just I just wanted to make a quick note regarding all these grades that you're going to be seeing here. My intention for doing these grade calculations is just to show the technical committee and the board the implications of the hybrid model, what it does to actual schools. Again, realizing that these are preliminary results. Because we are actually talking about two different letter grade configurations, two different letter grades, and how do we go about combining information from both, these tables sort of give you some background on what actually happens to schools based on these approaches. I just wanted to clarify why these grades were being calculated in these handouts, that this isn't me assigning schools grades by any means. This is me giving you information on what effect this approach has on the grades that are currently given by the board. So, looking at table 1 there, again, I went through all of these results during the prior committee meetings, so I don't need to go through them all again. I updated them based on the new information that was provided. For table 1 and table 2, results should largely be unchanged, and they are. Just a few highlights that I want to make regarding the information here. During the last set of tables, it sort of looked like the hybrid model was essentially taking the higher of the two letter grades. And you can see based on these tables that that is not always necessarily the case. There are certainly scenarios, for example, in, let's just take table 2 there. We have a CA school receiving a B under hybrid model and a B under the prorate model if that were used. So I just wanted to make that point that the hybrid model isn't really necessarily taking the higher of the two grades. It's merging the information from the other configuration in. Any questions? I think.
Yes. On table 1, the second line, where we have a school that has a current K-8 of C, then current and 9 through 12 of NR, then preliminary hybrid of B, how do they end up with a comparison prorated of NR?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Member Bachna. For purposes of this exercise, the department, based on the data files that were provided, if a school received an NR under the 912, their percentage of points earned was generally either left blank or set to 0. So I didn't feel comfortable trying to calculate a percentage for that school. I just left that as an NR. You can't average an NR with another quantity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so all of the ones for the prorate are going to be NR if there is one of the two grades that's not rated. And you'll see that in the table 1 and table 2 there.
So Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I really hope, Member Guyer, that you're present for the state board meeting because I know I will need your help in explaining this to the board. But as I'm looking at this, the question that comes to my mind is when we're looking at the preliminary hybrid and the comparison prorated, those are two different mathematical runnings that you did, correct?
Yes.
So what the board needs to decide, or maybe even what can be decided at this committee today, is which one the state board goes with, whether it's the prelim hybrid or the comparison prorated.
Okay. Yeah.
Am I correct? And then I'm asking you that question. Do we get to choose today, or is that?
Yes, that would be a great starting point because I gave the prorate just one to show what the effects of it are, and also to provide the flexibility to the committee and beyond, just to see what the modeling looks like for both. Okay, so Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, if it's the committee's wish, I think for clarification to the board members and to the general public, if the
I know that the board had already voted on that hybrid model, that when we put these charts to the state board members, that we take out either the prorated or the hybrid, so that it's very clear to the board members of what they're looking at.
Okay, yeah, that would be fine. From at least. Again, this was more for the committee's information to see what effects the two approaches have on the grades and the percentages, really, because this is what that's dealing with, is the percentages. Okay. The final change that was made was to Table 3. And this was basically an expression of the point under Model C.1. You can see that we had, looks like 8 schools that received, or is it 9? We had 9 schools that received a letter grade under the K-8 model, but no letter grade under the 9 to 12 model. The proposed approach, C.1, would have us merging the 9-12 information as available into the K-8 model, which uses growth at 50 points, proficiency at 30, the ELL as available, and the acceleration readiness. So I just provided the proposed Model C1 for those schools, merging those 9 schools K-8 grade together with the 9-12 information as available. So if there are any questions on that. So the final table that I provided was just for informational purposes, just to give you on the committee and the general public a sense of how many of the different configurations there were in Arizona last year, just showing that most of the pro-rate schools were in fact K-12. 40 of them, it was an even split between 6 to 12 and 7 to 12. 20 6 to 12 schools were merged into high school, and then 28 were 7 to 12. And then there were just a small number of schools that required merger into the K-8. This is likely due to a growing school that will eventually add the 12th grade, because you can't imagine a scenario where a student would want to attend a school from grade 6 to 11 and then transfer for a year and to another school for 12th grade. That would not be very reasonable. So that's the information in Table 4, just giving you a sort of a summary of which schools are where, how many there were, and then the final page is just the definition of table variables for your information and for clarity's sake. So again, that's everything I have regarding the hybrid model. There were 2 sort of separate questions here. The first one is use of the hybrid model itself, the idea of merging information into one of the 2 models based on the grade configuration. The second question was regarding missing data in the complete school configuration and how to handle that. Use the hybrid model or not. So. So were there any questions from Director Williams, if you have anything? Were there any questions from the committee members regarding this work to this point?
I'm just curious if we feel that, because there's a lot, I know that you did a lot on this and there's a lot of work that went into this. You said that there were, the majority of the time it wasn't that the schools ended up with the higher of the 2 grades, or is that not necessarily the case? I'm just curious in terms of, do we want to complicate the rules when we could leave it at take the higher of the 2 grades for those schools?
Again, my only concern with that is there are a number of cases where it would not be able to handle, for instance, in Table 1, a school like that C NR school that went to a B because the data in the NR category was very good data, with strong results, and that pulled the grade up. So there are going to be cases where it works against schools, but there are going to be cases where it works for schools. And it's certainly, from my perspective, adding more information, more student results, and will just ensure a better, higher quality result for everyone in terms of the stability.
Vice Chair Geyer, members of the committee, Member Bachna, one of the things that was discussed at the state board level was, originally it was the higher of the two scores. And then the state board members became concerned because you could have a K-8. Well, it was the higher of the two. Then we got into the entity number issue. So the state board was artificially creating schools by giving one school multiple grade levels, right? But then ultimately it came down to what's best for students. So you could have a school that's doing phenomenal in the 912, but their elementary kiddos aren't doing so hot. So by just following the 912 model, you don't necessarily account for what's going on at that school at the 3-8 level, let's say. And just making sure that the students are getting the education that is warranted of them. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, Vice Chair Geyer, I think with what you've done within the hybrid model, and then even at the K-12 school level, you're able to take information for all students within that school and calculate it in such a way that is accurately showcasing what that school's doing for kids?
Yes, using proficiency growth. That's currently what's being used to adjust. And like you see in Table 3 there, under the first set of part of the table, there was a school who actually was a C, K-8, and went to a D in the hybrid model. So again, it does take into account all of that information. Yep.
So I just need to understand too, are you suggesting that some schools be evaluated using the prorated model and some schools be evaluated using the hybrid model? Or I just need to clarify on that on Table 4.
Oh, under Table 4.
Yes. So are you suggesting we should have two models, or are you thinking one or the other?
So just to be clear, one of the ideas behind, like you see there in Table 4, a number of the K-12 schools were then using the prorate model. One of the responses that I was trying to make when I thought of the use of both Model 2 and 4, so-called hybrid model, was the concern that if we just take one of the two models, we're leaving out valuable information from the other model that we're leaving out. So that's why you see there's prorate and then there's the hybrid approach. and one of the, go ahead.
Vice Chair Geyer, Member Bach, and I think to kind of wrap it up, like wrap it in a tight little bow, it's almost as if your school serves K-12, 112, 212, 312, or 412, you're under this prorate model, which you're calculating all the students and their data. And then if you're a 5 and all the other grades up to 12, you're in that merge to the 912. If you don't have a 12th grade, you merge down to the K-8. So essentially I think the Member Geyer, this first page where it's A, B, C, and C1 is very clear to at least myself, and how you explained the three different ways to calculate it. I think ultimately as well, the state board was very concerned that there were 108 schools in Arizona that not only received 2 letter grades, but then once the preliminary letter grades were released, they were not rated. So it was of utmost importance that we figured out a way to rate them so that they could have a letter grade. And Vice Chair Geyer, it looks like all of but 15 schools could potentially have a letter grade now.
Yes, that is correct.
So Acting Chair Guyer, this is kind of a clarification. So the way I understand it too, the hybrid model includes A, B, and C. It includes merging. It includes actually the schools that are merged to the K-8, the schools that are merged to the 9-12, and then the schools that are prorated.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you.
And that's sort of where the hybrid came from. I don't know if I came up with that or if I came up during our committee meeting on it. It's the idea that it wasn't just one, it was a little bit of both. And again, just one other point I wanted to make for I don't know if it's for clarification or just for everyone, that the driving force behind the decision to try adopting the C1 approach for those schools was to try and give schools with a grade and NR a grade, rather than leaving them with either the grade or that they had or just an NR. Just a point of clarification on that. That came from our last TAC meeting where that was raised as a possible idea. Any other questions or comments on that? I'm hearing any. So, Director Williams, may I ask you a question regarding the next steps on the motion and all that? Thank you. So would it necessarily be the ABC presented in the handout? Would that be the motion necessarily, or would it be some of what we were discussing vis-a-vis the tables and what to present to the board?
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, if you would like to, I think what Dr. Sussman said, where she stated the hybrid model includes A, B,
yes.
C, and I don't know if we're calling it C or C1.
It's C, and then C1 is an exception, yes.
So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe A, B, C, and C1 are kind of sort of business rules, right?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to create a motion in regard to accepting a if you want to create a motion in regard to recommending the hybrid model, including the business rules stated, and you can read them if you wish, or you can state as presented. But I and the general public will know, because when I go to write the recommendation in the executive summary, all of that will be included. A, B, C, and C.
Okay, thank you. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to read the entire set of business rules. Thank you. So then I'll make a motion to adopt the hybrid model with the business rules that were stated in the document and presented.
Vice Chair Guyer.
Acting Chair Guyer, my friendly amendment would be to specify A, B, C, and C1 in our motion.
Okay.
Do you accept that?
Yes, I do.
Amendment? Okay.
And Dr. Haladina, do you accept that?
Approve. I approve.
Okay. Were there any points of discussion regarding the motion? Hearing none. Director Williams? Just a sec.
Before you do that, just one clarification for me. On table 1, then, I know I already asked about this NR thing. In that situation, on table 1, for that row, the second row, the school would be evaluated with the hybrid model, not the, I don't want them to end up with the NR, I guess is my concern. They would end up with the B?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I think if it's the committee's wish, I'd work with Member Guyer to maybe strike some of the comparison prorated out for the board meeting if the technical advisory committee votes to push this recommendation to the state board, so that it's very clear to the state board what the impact data shows. Okay, so roll call vote on the motion to adopt the hybrid model for non-typical school configurations to include the business rules A, B, C, and C1 as presented. Dr. Beardsley?
Yes.
Member Bachna?
Aye.
Member Hovanich?
Yes.
Member Jordan?
Yes.
Member Haladina?
Yes.
Member Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Schlesman?
Aye.
And Member Guyer?
Yes.
With your vote of 8-0, the recommendation to the State Board of Education for the hybrid model for non-typical school configurations to include the business rules A, B, C, and C1 as presented will go forth to the State Board of Education at its January 29, 2018 State Board meeting. Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I would recommend going to item 3, future meeting dates and items for future agendas. Member Guyer, I do know that certain committee members wish to speak in regard to item 3 today.
Yeah, so we'll move to item 3, the future meeting dates and agendas. Items? Does any members of the committee or anyone wish to share information to Director Williams or the State Board of Education regarding agenda item 3?
This is Christy Hovanitz, Director Williams, members of the committee. I just want to share with you some of the research we've done since the last board meeting with respect to risk factors and achieving a zero correlation, and just share with the committee or remind the committee of all the hard work that's been done in Arizona up until this point. Arizona had a very strong A-through F school grading system that didn't account for risk factors or focus on reducing the correlation to zero, and produced some pretty substantial results, as you can see in the handout I provided to Director Williams. In all subgroups, in both reading and math at both 4th and 8th grade, Arizona substantially outpaced the nation in improvement of student scores. And I think this is something just to keep in mind as the TAC committee is working forward on making decisions about what's best for students in Arizona, is that there has already been substantial progress made and continues to be made in Arizona in accommodating or setting expectations differently for students. In here too is also some research, recent research in the last year that really demonstrates that setting high expectations and maintaining high expectations for kids really comes through in results. So just want to share some highlights on some of the really good things that are happening in Arizona. The rest of the document just highlights some of the things we haven't talked about as a TAC yet, but were brought up at some of the first meetings, and how we hope to see some of the TAC directions go. And also at this time, I would like to say that I am submitting my resignation from the TAC, and will no longer be joining the TAC as it further deliberates the reform of the A-through system.
Thank you, Member Hovanich. Was there any other committee members that wish to have future meeting items? I know I have some things I would like to share, so just let me know.
Yeah, Acting Chair Guyer, I have a couple. So
I do too, that follows up on that comment. Is that okay if I go first?
So do I.
So real quickly, Director Williams, I also sent out 2 peer-reviewed articles that talk about the free and reduced lunch correlation and also controlling for student risk variables that I don't believe were sent to the committee. And so I'd like those to be sent as well, because that pertains directly to this document from Member Hovanitz that was just passed out. And also, I've done some research on my own in terms of the NAEP and looking at the 12 to 14 states that are using the A through F system, and there's no clear results across the board in terms of even back in 1999 when Florida adopted this system, what happens with the NAEP, and we're almost 20 years out now in terms of the state adopting it, but it's also true across the other 12 to 14 states. The NAEP is the best indicator. I think most of us would agree with that to look at that, but there's no conclusive evidence in terms of what the impact these A through F systems have on these states that are using them from the point at which they implement them as per each state. Likewise, in Arizona, these results, while they look pretty astonishing, if you look at the actual NAEP, the state data calculator, there's not conclusive evidence across the board. It's pretty much not statistically significant differences that look pretty significant on the graphs presented. And that's it. I'm sorry.
Vice Chair Guyer, Member Beardsley, was there anything else that you wish to discuss?
I do for the agenda. Oh. So just the general agenda, but I think that Member Schlesman can go first at that point.
Okay. So, Acting Chair Guyer, I wanted to raise again the question for future agenda or work of the TAC. And it's contained in the document that was the Technical Advisory Committee rationale, scope and function, structure and procedures. It has been posted online. In scope and function, it says the mission of the TAC is to advise the board of interpretations. You hear my emphasis on the syllables, and findings of all of its members regarding the systematic and objective application of qualitative, quantitative, I did that reversed, and mixed methodologies. Further, it says the Technical Advisory Committee will, first bullet point, discuss and evaluate the systematic and objective application. And then the second bullet point is present findings and recommendations. So even in that October State Board of Ed meeting, I remember State Board of Ed member Wellborn talking about the fact that we were all volunteers and that we had day jobs, and that, and I'm putting, I don't know her exact words, but it was something like the data calculations should not be expected of the TAC members. And it was my observation that we were all a little bit surprised about the amount of data calculations that were going to take place. I will say that it depends upon your interpretation of the second bullet point, because if you have to present findings, you can't really present findings of interpretations if there's not data calculations to present findings on. But, and then I remember Member Baker commented, well, people knew they were getting into this when they applied for the position, but I don't think we all did. And then I wish I remembered which board member stated this, and that's the reason I gave illustrative cases in my ELL measure analysis, because someone said that it would be acceptable, rather than to model the entire thing, to present illustrative cases. So I think that issue of how we interpret our scope and function is something that I've heard us question, and I would like to get some clarification on that. So that was my first item, and actually if any of us have further discussion of that issue, let's address that before I move on to the second one.
Vice Chair Guyer, Vice Chair Guyer, Dr. Schlesman, would you like me to seek clarification on the tax roll from the State Board of Education?
I would.
I would.
I'm seeing heads nod. Does anyone else want to step up and do more than nod your head?
I think it would be helpful to have that clarification. Yes,
Okay,
thank you, Dr. Schlesman.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I will seek clarification from the State Board of Education on the tax role of the scope and function of the Technical Advisory Committee. In regard to some of the points that Dr. Schlesman brought up, it does lead into kind of what's going forward for TAC of things that I know of. We need to start focusing on the 17-18 AITRF school accountability. There are some things that need to be taken out per federal requirements. I am now meeting with my 6th potential consultant for this committee next week. So hopefully I have some news for this committee. I know that that was something that Member Beardsley had brought up, Member Wellborn at the state board level, in regard to having a consultant for this technical advisory committee, and to also help with the department and whatnot. And then we also do need to focus on alternative schools and their AITRF plan. So just 3 things I had, and I know that Dr. Haladina is waiting patiently to speak.
Do you want me to finish my second one or let member?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So Acting Chair Guyer, Executive Director Williams anticipated my second point, and she said that this committee will, there were some questions about the alternative 9 through 12 model that were posed to the State Board of Ed by the Alternative Accountability Advisory Committee group, Alt-AG. And the State Board of Ed referred those to this committee. Our priority has been to talk about the traditional model because it is going to be used for federal accountability. I understand that. Also, correct me, Member Haladina, or if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I know at least he said that some of the topics merited a study session. I think some of the rest of us did, but I definitely think that a study session on alternative schools would inform our work, because I know that Mesa Unified has an alternative school. I'm not sure how many of the rest of you are familiar with what alternative schooling in Arizona is nationally, and then specifically in Arizona. So I would like to see that as first a study session for this group as we start to address those technical pieces that the State Board of Ed has assigned to be answered or addressed. I don't know if we have the answers, but to be addressed by this group.
Vice Chair Guyer, members of the committee, I think Member Haladina had a comment.
Okay, is it my turn?
Yes, sir, for future agenda items.
Okay, I think I've said this before, so I'll repeat myself. In my many years of working with testing programs, I think I worked with over maybe 40 or 50 different testing programs. I pretty much adhere to the standards for educational and psychological testing, and my experience in evaluating testing programs, designing testing programs, and writing technical reports is that technical documentation is very important for validity. And so far, I have not seen any technical documentation for validity. So given that there's no evidence, I would assume this accountability system does not function properly. And until I see such data, I have to draw the same conclusion. I have to see technical documentation about validity. I have to know about reliability. I have to know about conditional standard errors. And there's a plethora of questions that need to be answered. And I think the most important question to answer is, if an A school gets an A, what exactly did they do to earn an A? Because the whole world wants to know, what did they do? And surprisingly, an accountability system doesn't seem to inform anybody about what schools are doing. So I guess the whole world wants to know, why did an A school become an A? I put this in writing, I think, and I think in previous papers, so I can refer to some of those documents I've authored previously, if that helps. But anyway, I would like to see more serious attention being paid to technical documentation as outlined in a chapter in the standards for educational and psychological testing. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haladina. Any other?
I would like to follow up on Member Haladina's comment. Also, as per the standards of psychological and educational testing, before any consequences are attached to output from a system such as the one with which we're working now, we have to have that evidence of reliability or validity. Otherwise, we as a state are going possibly liable in terms of not having that evidence in support of making consequential decisions. And in this case, it's based on funding. So I want to underscore the importance of evidence for reliability and validity of the system.
One more comment I can add. Heather Carter, Dr. Heather Carter, I understand, is proposing a bill that would basically change the whole testing structure of the state where people, schools would elect which test they want to give. Serving on the National Technical Advisory Committee for Arizona, as I have in Kansas and Washington and Oregon in the past, this move would basically jettison the AZ merit as a criterion measure, and I don't think that would do well for this accountability system. I don't think the people I serve with on this committee, national committee, would endorse using ACT and SAT as accountability measures. That would really, really confuse the whole system.
Yep, thank you, Dr. Haladina. Were there any other comments, questions regarding agenda item 3?
Okay.
None at this point?
Do you have a motion to it? Vice President Guyer, the next thing is, do you have a motion to adjourn? I apologize.
Yes, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Not yet. Do we have another date for a meeting?
Vice Chair Guyer, Member Haladina, the State Board of Education meeting is January 29th, which is not upcoming Monday, but in 2 weeks. So we should probably schedule something we decided as a committee on Fridays between 2 and 3 o'clock. We can do the second Thursday of the month or the second Friday of the month or the last Friday of the month. The third Friday of the month is very difficult for board staff because we're getting board books out for the board members. Sorry, I'm like, all my dates are bonkers. But Fridays are good.
Acting Chair Guyer, are we allowed to say if we have a preference for what Friday the standing meeting would be?
Yes.
The second Friday of the month would be good for me as a standing meeting time.
Yeah. Fine by me.
I have a question, just because we're all here and on the phone. Is it possible to move it up a bit so we don't all get stuck in traffic right now?
Oh.
Like to 1 to 3 or noon to 2? I don't know if that impedes on people's lunches, but
yes.
Yes?
Actually, that
would be better.
So I moved?
Yeah, that would be better. Yes.
One. I like 1.
Yeah.
1 to 3?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sooner, even noon would be fine.
Noon would be fine with me too. Okay.
Yeah.
Meeting changed from, I don't remember if it was 11 or noon to 4 o'clock on the same day so that we could make quorum. And so by changing that, it messed up my schedule. And then at that meeting, there was another meeting scheduled within 48 hours. So just because of the logistics, that might need to be reconsidered. And you'll also remember we were going to delay voting on a chair during that first meeting. And then we raised the issue again. And there was this, I think, Member Haladina asked if any of us were willing to chair the committee, and there was this long, uncomfortable silence But so at that point, I thought there was a void, leadership void that needed to be filled, but now I think we have very well established ourselves as leaders, and the committee might feel more comfortable voting again in the future.
So Vice Chair Guyer, the Chair Schlesman, what you're stating is that for a future agenda item, you would like to have a Chair, Vice Chair vote again?
Either that or just chair. But if the current vice chair gets elected as chair, then we'd have to do the vice chair also.
Okay, I
Yes.
can add that to the agenda.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any last final things regarding future meetings and items for future agendas? If not, would you have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion to adjourn.
I'll second it.
All in favor, say aye.
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 So this meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee is adjourned at 3:45.
Hey, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Christy.
Thanks.